This is International Master Eric Kislik, and I'll be covering a couple of games from round one of the candidates, which just started yesterday. And it was really surprising to see it was so blood-filled with 3 decisive games out of 4. I think one thing to say before we get into the games or go into anything is that it's important to not get caught in a narrative of basically congratulating the winner on every single move that they played or every single idea they played simply because they won. I think Kramnik played a fantastic game, but as we'll see, he had an interesting opening choice, quite good middle game play, but at a couple phases in the middle game he was certainly not better, and maybe even in a couple spots he was slightly worse. So it was just a complicated game, and he came out the winner, but as you'll see, even late in the end game, Black had some chances, but this is often how elite Grandmaster games go. So, Kramnik deserves all the credit for the win. It was a very good game. I just want to clarify that, just so that people don't get caught up in this narrative of, basically thinking a game was a perfect game when you actually get down to looking at the moves. You can see that there was some back and forth, there was some give and take, and the game was actually quite complicated. So let's take a look at the game. It went d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6. Now Kramnik played the very rare b3. I think he just wanted to get Grischuk out of preparation and basically just play a balanced line. He probably had a couple of new ideas and a couple new lines. And Grischuk went for c5. The main line is bishop g7. So c5, and one of Black's ideas here is just to simply take on d4 and then play d5. So White played d takes c5 and Black checked. Black can also just play bishop g7. So queen a5 check was played. I thought the most challenging idea for White would be to just go queen to d2. And the idea here is he gets to chase the queen away with bishop a3, and then he can play knight c3 and queenside castle. That offers White pretty interesting chances for an advantage, but he played it in a more typical way. So he went bishop to b2, bishop g7, e3, castle, c4. So, White's playing a very standard kind of setup here. He would normally like to go bishop e2 and castle. It can also be interesting to go g3 and bishop g2 in some cases. For example, after b6 was played, another idea for Black could have been to play rook to d8, which in some cases threatens to go d5, which is one of his only main pawn breaks, so is definitely worth considering. So after b6, he could go g3. He may have considered that if he followed this path, it wouldn't be that easy to find a clear plan for White, so I can definitely understand why he played what he did. So in the game, he just went for bishop to e2, bishop b7, castle. The only issue he has here is how should he develop his pieces. And I thought a better way to do it would be just to simply go d6. And now, if Kramnik played the plan that he did in the game with knight b1, then Black would have time to go knight b1, knight bd7, knight c3, and then d5. And with d5 coming in, the center liquidates and Black equalizes. So probably d6 was the best move, simply because there was no need to move the queen yet. So since the queen has moved, White could have played b4. That looked like an ambitious try, but of course he just went rook c1, improving his worst place piece. d6, and he played knight to b1, which might seem like a very surprising move to some players, but this is a common sort of rerouting. He's trying to put the knight on c3, and the knights on d2 and f3 sometimes trip over each other and are sometimes called superfluous knights, especially in positions where the knights are trying to occupy most of the same squares. So after knight bd7, he went knight c3, rook ac8. Black simply improves his worst place piece, and now the only issue for Black is what to do with his queen. So after rook to c2 was played, which was a good move. The interesting thing is that White has the same issue. What should White do with his queen, and what should Black do with his queen? So one plan for White is simply to put the queen on d2. Black can also put his queen on d7. Another plan for White, which was actually played in the game, was to put the queen on a1. And interestingly, Black could do the same thing and put his queen on a8. So after rook c2, Black decided to go for queen b8. I kind of like just going knight c5 and queen d7 and then playing rook fd8 this way. This looks like a good way to equalize. But there was nothing fundamentally wrong with what he played. So Up to here, it looks like both players have played pretty well. So queen a1, a6, and a6 gives black the possibility of playing b5 after preparation at some point. So rook to d2 was played. So one thing I want to point out with this queen a1 ready maneuver that was played by Kramnik is that white actually doesn't have any dangerous threats at the moment. One of the main points here is that he's making it difficult for black's f6 knight to move in a lot of different cases. So you'll see some interesting lines here where the bishop might go back to f8 or might go out to h6. So for example here, white has a choice to make with his rooks too. He could go rook fc1. In the game he went for rook to d2 and rook fd1. That is probably the best practical chance. I was thinking an interesting plan for black here could be to go bishop h6. You might think that's a pretty strange looking move, but the bishop is no longer undefended, so that battery with the queen on a1 and the bishop on b2 is no longer dangerous. In any case, he went rook fe8, rook fd1, and bishop to a8. So bishop a8 allows him to threaten the b5 idea, which can be pretty dangerous. So for example, in the game, knight to g5 was a mistake by Kramnik. So here I think Kramnik is slightly worse. What he should have played is probably just something calm like h3 or knight e1 and just sort of rerouted his pieces. After knight g5, black could have played b5, which is a really nice move. The key line here is after c takes b5, a takes b5. If bishop takes b5, there's the nice move, rook to c5. And now if bishop takes d7, there's rook takes g5, attacking g2. And so if f4, we can play the desperado, rook takes g2, rook takes g2, knight takes d7. And here, white's main problem is his king position. So for example, if knight to d5, black can just go e6 and regain material. So b5 would have been a really nice move to throw in there. So in this position, rook c5 was played, attacking the knight on g5. The knight had to go back, so black went for b5 here. Perhaps white should have just simply taken on b5 and played b4. This may have been the best way to play it now. But he went knight to f4, which also wasn't bad. I think the main thing that was difficult to play here was just to accept that probably he should have allowed the damaging of his pawn structure with b takes c4. He tried to avoid structural damage with bishop takes c4. Problem here is, let's say black had just played knight e5 and then queen b7 trying to target the g2 pawn. Here if he goes f3, queen a7, it's already pretty awkward for white to defend. For example, the e3 pawn's undefended. It's a little bit unpleasant to play. I think black is slightly better there. So in the game, rook g5 was played, which was certainly natural to try to target the g2 pawn. Knight cd5. And here, what may have been missed is that he could just simply simplify the position. Knight takes d5, and now bishop takes g7 is a bad move because of simply knight takes f4 because of the g2 pawn. So bishop takes d5 was played, bishop takes b2, queen takes b2, knight f6. So in this line, the position would only be equal. Actually, there's a very funny variation here. If rook takes d6 to undermine the f6 knight, take, an interesting idea could be to just play knight to h5 to get perpetual check. For example, check, and it's only perpetual. The king cannot escape. If king e7, of course, queen takes d6 mate. So that would have been a way to equalize right here. So at this stage, the position's only equal. Knight e5, basically the problem with knight e5 is it messed up black's coordination too much. So now the rook on g5 is in a very awkward place. So probably here, although it isn't necessarily being trapped, so he could have still played a useful move like a5 here to defend his pawn on a6. But knight e4 was played, and I think better would have been to play rook to c2, and then he could try to play h4 after that. The point of going rook c2 is he can go queen c1, and there's quite a good battery along the c file. He went rook to d4. Probably the best now would have just been to go knight f6 and try to exchange the knight on d5. He went knight c5, and the biggest problem here is that white could have just played the simple move g4. And with g4, he would have trapped the rook. But the important thing here is he traps the rook, but for very little compensation. So this would have been very strong for white. So in the game, you'll see that black actually got very good compensation because he was able to win the e4 pawn. And there are a couple ways to win the e4 pawn. He could take with the bishop or with the knight. I think taking with the knight was fine. I think taking with the bishop also wouldn't have been a bad move as well, because here the bishop is basically on e4 rather than on a8, so it's a bit more active. For example, with a5, he can play h5 and then a5, and black's pieces are not badly placed here. So he actually, he has that pass pawn on d6. Not that it's going anywhere anytime soon, but it is very useful, the fact that it's there. So anyway, knight takes e4, knight d5, and here black just played too passively with knight c5. He should have simply played f5. And after f5, if you take a position like this, black actually has very good compensation here. Let's say white tries to improve his queen, queen c1 and queen to e3. I was thinking white's slightly better here, but nevertheless, black actually has pretty good compensation. He has two pretty good bishops. His central structure gives him a lot of central presence. He has two pawns in the center versus 0, so actually has pretty good compensation. After knight c5, the biggest problem with this is that white could have just continued the attack very directly with h5. I didn't really understand why he didn't just simply go for h5. Here too, he could also just go h5, and then his plan after that could be rook h4. So white's attack kind of flows very directly here. And here black's main mistake was simply not playing h5 himself. So he could go h5 and then a5. So a5 was played, rook b5, knight to e6. And here's a typical case where it would be very easy to look at rook takes e5 and just say this is a mind-blowing, unbelievable, brilliant move. It's a pretty good move. White definitely maintains his advantage. The important thing to realize here is, what if white had simply played a4, for instance? Let's say a4, I don't know, it's hard to find a move for black. Let's say rook f8, b4, takes. Here it looks like white's a pawn is very strong, so had this position occurred in the game, it's a little bit unclear whether black would have been able to save the game or not. The a pawn is very, very strong. So when you actually take a look at what happened in the game after rook takes e5, takes, here black made a mistake of going queen c5. He should have exchanged and then gone queen c5. And now let's take a look at this endgame that could have arisen here. Let's say we go for this endgame, black improves his bishop with bishop to b7. So is this position really that great for white? Yes, white has some pressure against the a5 pawn once he goes knight c4, but there's a very high rate of, likelihood of a draw here. For example, if black just plays solidly, meeting knight c4 with rook a8, for example, here, rook to a8, it's going to be very difficult to actually win this position. So I think this would have been slightly better for white, but most likely within the realm of a draw. So queen c5 was played, bishop takes g7, knight takes g7, and here the main mistake was that white could have just played simply rook c1 and didn't have to go into the endgame here. Could have gone queen c3 and later tried to pursue h5. So this, I think, would have given white a very good position. And part of the reason is because black's knight would have been very passive on g7. So he went for queen to d4, and after queen d4 takes. So now we have this endgame again. White goes rook to c2, which is a pretty nice move. He's intending to go rook c2 now after rook d2. So in this position, white has the simple plan of rook to c2, but black could have just played knight to e6. And the point is, if rook c2, there's knight to d4. So I think knight to e6 was simply missed, and then if knight c4, there's rook to a8. And then if here, actually we could just go rook to d8. So in this particular position, white is again a little bit better, but most likely the correct result would have been a draw. So he played this, which put him in some trouble because white was able to go rook c2 and then rook to c7. Now with the potential of taking the pawn on e7 and also of playing rook a7 like was played in the game, it's a very difficult position to defend. So here king f8 was played. I think the best chance, probably the last chance, was to go a4 and rook a8. So at least he can be certain that white is only left with one extra pawn, and it's very hard to advance. Basically, white's only real chance to win this is to promote the a pawn, but it's going to be very difficult to do that. Probably what he needs to do is exchange off rooks beforehand so that he's able to push the pawn later and support it with his king. So this will definitely take quite a bit of time. So king f8 was played, and then white played rook a7, and this position is probably winning for white. So for instance, if knight to e6 and then knight to d4, white can play a5, and he still retains his extra pawn, which can later go up to a6. So that position appears to be winning for white. So check was played, and then rook to b4, attacking a4 and h4. White simply went a5, and then king to g1. And black's main problem is what to do about that a pawn. So he went rook a4, then bishop to c4 was played. And I thought even if knight e6, white could just go here, and then just go a6, and let's say takes, and then rook c7, and then a7, and white's winning. So there appears to be no way to defend here. So rook c7 was a good move, attacking the bishop, and he simply went a6. And yeah, black does not appear to have any way to prevent white from playing a7. So after knight h5, knight to d5 was played, and black resigned in view of a7 and knight to b6. So it was a quite well played endgame by Kramnik, and there were a lot of interesting ideas he played. The exchange sacrifice was an interesting attempt. And towards the later phase of the game, Kramnik was never in any danger, but as we can see, Grischuk could have put up definitely some better defense. I'll be putting the this analysis here in the description below. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. Thanks a lot.